Yusra is the best person to ask this question back to. So my name is Hawa. Those are a lot of questions, and maybe I'll start with the basic, which is I think we fall into the trap of homogenizing Blackness. So we can't out-organize what we also ourselves don't quite understand. And so, because there's a sophisticated machinery, we can talk about the suitable candidates over and over and over again, but really we're talking about, at the core, a very sophisticated machinery that's had a lot of time to develop itself and work out the kinks. And it's hard to beat something that's so sophisticated or out-organize it when trauma makes it very difficult for Black people to also work through the reasons that organizing is hard in the first place. So I think that's the place I want to start first. And I say that a lot of my work has been centered around the Somali community in Toronto and in Canada. And I think about Robyn's book. If you get a chance to flip through it, there's copies in the back. One of the things that struck me is 4.4% of the population, and yet every single major institution has done something to Somali people, and they've only been here for 30 years. There's something very shocking about that for me, right? So it tells me there's a very sophisticated set of rules for how we treat Black people, and Somalis arrived and immediately those rules were enacted. So this is such a great, not great for us living it, but I'm saying it's such an interesting place to start to think about this is what happens. We get drowned in the experiences, and it becomes really difficult to ask people to step out of the experiences of trauma to then begin to organize. That takes a very difficult kind of work. So, a lot of people are doing that work. I think we need to find some ways to do it better.
I absolutely think that we can always out-organize white supremacy. Absolutely. There's a local electronic musician duo named Lal in Toronto that have been making music together for 20 years, and they have this line in a song called Brown Eyed Warrior where they say, "It's not all we've got, but they still can't figure shit out." And it's just this idea that we have only just begun. They haven't even seen what we're actually capable of in terms of our organizing, and they have no possible idea or consideration of what's actually going on. So I believe that we have the capacity to out-organize white supremacy, absolutely. But we're living in dangerous, dangerous times, and I think that it's so I really appreciate Robyn's lecture, and I really appreciate your question, Yusra, in the way that it brings together a consideration of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and gendered violence in one conversation. When I think back to some of the organizing against white supremacy that's happened here in Toronto, I think about Nzinga Maxwell. And I think about Nzinga Maxwell because we're sitting here at Ryerson. And Nzinga was an organizer who was doing organizing around, anti-Blackness and around white supremacy. She was doing sex worker organizing. She was doing organizing around migration. And she was a really long-term volunteer at CKLN, which was the community radio station here at Ryerson. And in terms of this conversation about snitch lines and people sort of tipping people off, it was actually Ryerson security that ended up tipping off immigration to come and arrest Nzinga while she was selling cupcakes to raise money for CKLN at the end of an International Women's Day rally. She was deported a week later, right? So thinking about these moments, that we are living in very dangerous times, but I have to believe that we will win. I have to believe that we can outsmart, well, we absolutely can outsmart white supremacy. That's the question, but that we can out-organize white supremacy.
All right, so I'm going to move to the next question. So when reading Policing Black Lives, what about this book connected deeply with the work that you do for Black lives in our multiple communities? And thinking specifically about our current condition as Black people, what did the book do to signal, mark, unmark, or make urgent in relationship to the experience of anti-Black state violence on Black people here in Canada?
I think that what the book does so successfully is that it reminds us that the abolition of slavery was an unfinished project. And so, you know, the things that Robyn talks about in the book, the ways that gendered violence plays out, the ways that racialized violence plays out, is in keeping with what happened on slave labor camps here in the north part of Turtle Island, and yes, in the south, of course, as well. So this idea that this kind of abolition, if you will, that we're working to fight for is actually the abolition of slavery. So when we're talking about prison abolition, we're talking about the abolition of slavery, because we actually haven't yet achieved that. And I think that when you look at the history and what you know, in terms of what we're told not only that slavery didn't exist in Canada, but that slavery is a completed project. It was done, it was abolished, it's over. And it is absolutely 100% not over. And that this book really kind of highlights the ways that the violence from the slave labor camp carries forward into this current moment, and it explains the Black Death spectacle that we've witnessed in the media and sort of over the last, absolutely in the last 3 or 4 years, you know, in a heightened way.
And I think for me it brings it into a contemporary moment, right? It's what are the new recent examples that prove that the state's not finished, whatever it's begun. And for me, it raises a lot of questions because I think we talk about Blackness frequently through the transatlantic slave trade, and I think about a contemporary example of a Somali arriving who's walked into an inherited history, but is also carrying anti-Black racism from an Arab supremacy perspective, which is completely different, and then has to live through whatever this active terrorist moment looks like, and to some extent, this idea that Arabs and Muslims are somehow separate from Blackness. So there's all these very complicated things that then become apparent. So I think for me, reading it and thinking about how, to some extent, my community would receive it, it wouldn't be, I think it would be received very differently than the ways people think about Blackness when they've been in North America for quite some time, right? So what does migration look like? And what does anti-Black racism look like for those who are carrying other kinds of histories around anti-Black racism? So, and not just for Somalis, right? We're talking about any major Black group that's coming into Canada. What does anti-Black racism look like from the place that they're from? There's a Professor Jemima Pierre who's written this excellent book around the predicament of Blackness in Ghana, and talks about how anti-Black racism shows up in Ghana too. Like, it's majority Black countries are still experiencing colonial legacies that are fundamentally about the creation of Blackness in a particular way, right? And the East and the Horn experience those histories very differently than the West and Central and South Africa. The East was the slave ports. Most of them on the East Coast were developed by the Arab Peninsula and were then used by the British and the French and the Italian and Europeans, but they were pre-existing. So that says something too about the state of Blackness for longer than 500 years and beyond the transatlantic slave trade. This Blackness has always been considered disposable for a lot of us. So, and in very different contexts. So I think that's the interesting interplay for me in reading the book. It's how do you reconcile the histories of inheritance, like here you are, in the same way that you talk through what does it mean to be on land that's stolen, what does it also mean to inherit a particular experience of Blackness that's not even an experience of Blackness you quite understand, or isn't your experience of Blackness, right? So this is, I think I come back to that piece around, it's so hard for me to even talk about and I strategize all the time, outsmarting or out-strategizing white supremacy when they deport some of us and they jail others of us purposefully, and they make sure those groups don't quite know who's getting deported and who's getting jailed, so that we never quite figure out what's happening. That's the same. Anyway, it's an institution, it's a jail. And I think for me, the text was really helpful because we have an over-focus across North America on police. I work with young people. Like, police is not, I spend a lot of time with Somali moms. Like, the police is not the only system that makes it possible for someone to be surveilled. By no means, right? having to go to an OW office and ask for 2 tokens every single time you want to get on a TTC car. Like, that's surveillance. That's somebody asking about your everyday movements. You get 1 trip a day? Come on. Like, this is, we're beyond. We can't say that that's not a way that we're also making sure people aren't moving and mobile. So when I talk to people in my neighborhood and they say, we've never been downtown, I'm like, well, yeah, I probably wouldn't go either if I got 1 trip a day. That makes it a little tough to move, right? So these are the, like, I think the broadening of surveillance is something that's hard for us to do because policing also brings a particular kind of outrage. I think we're focused on extreme kinds of violence. We don't think about